So can I just say a very warm welcome to the three of you. And the focus, of course, is on the board-CEO relationship. So perhaps I can ask you each in turn, what do you see as key to a good board-CEO relationship?
Do you want to start with me? So, I think absolutely the key to a good board and CEO relationship is making sure that you have complete openness and honesty and trust and respect between the two. There's a very different role that each is playing, but having that openness and trust is incredibly important. And you've got to have a CEO that you have complete faith in and that you completely back to help the CEO be extremely successful. In my view, one of the roles of the chair is actually to make the CEO be fantastic and to do a fantastic job. And so getting behind him, absolutely supporting, helping to mentor him, opening up doors, other people for them to speak to, just helping their overall development. But bringing best practice, I guess, to the CEOs, where you see on other boards things being done really well, being able to open that door for your CEO to go and speak to another CEO and who's had a similar challenge in the past is really important. And finally, being able to actually give that harsh feedback to the CEO on things which maybe aren't right or areas that he can develop further in.
Thank you. Tony?
I'd agree with everything that Susan says. I suppose one aspect I have is my background's largely in cooperatives and with foodstuffs. And one thing I learned very, very early on is you never try and mislead your board, because they actually knew more about what was happening within the company than you did. Because they're in a franchise organisation, they hear it from the truck driver who's delivering the groceries that day. They hear it right from everybody. And so you understand that if you try and filter stuff, you get found out pretty quickly. So it's basically just being honest, respectful. I think Susan also identified it. The role of the chair is pivotal because they are the interface between the CEO and the board. They're the ones that has the personal one-on-one relationship. So basically, the chair's role is both to manage the CEO but also to manage the board and try and keep that relationship harmonious.
And I agree with everything the pair of them have said before me. If I'm the last in the line all the way through, it's going to be a pretty easy job. I'd just emphasise a couple of things that they both said, which is that the government's management divide is important. So it is important that the board does not intrude on the role of the CEO. In my view, the CEO is the pivotal role in the organisation, and the board's role generally is to challenge, debate, monitor, but certainly not to manage. I do think too that there should be care to control communication between the board and the CEO. Boards or directors can forget how seriously CEO and management take them. Unless there is control of communication, there can be very mixed messages. So that at the minimum, the chair should be copied in on any communication. But a really good principle is that communication through the CEO and the senior leadership team is via the chair. And finally, a CEO role is a lonely one. And it's great if the CEO can view his board as a peer group, someone with whom, or people with whom he can have full, frank conversations and learn from their experience.
Okay, thank you. So if I was to say, if you were giving advice to a CEO on how to best approach a board, what advice would you give them? What should the relationship be like? How should they approach in terms of provision of information? What happens when things are going wrong and the wheels are coming off? So from the perspective of the people in this room, what should they know about you and your role and what you're trying to do at your table?
If I can start, the one that I always found that causes the most tension is you have, as a CEO, you have your delegations, and it's absolutely clear what is your responsibility and what then is delegated to the board. What always causes the tension are those that aren't on the delegations, and they're largely reputational. They're things that the CEO believes was within his ambit, his or her ambit, and the board believe it's within their ambit, and it's ambiguous. And those are the ones that I think the CEO's got to be very sensitive, and the board's got to be sensitive to what the particular requirements or the sort of the understanding is in those unclear areas. And they actually go around. Boards do not want to be embarrassed. And so if they read something in the Herald tomorrow that they felt they should have been told about in advance and they haven't been, that's where boards get really upset. So I think just being open and honest and trying to see it from the board's point of view, as well as the CEO's point of view, is probably the key advice I'd give.
No surprises.
No surprises.
Alistair?
And I think Tony's absolutely right. If there is bad news, front up immediately and don't prevaricate. There's a whole string of examples of people who didn't do that, who lied, and really all the trouble stems from the lie. So that I heard Jeff Ricketts say once that he wants to know the bad news first. So I think that there's immediate disclosure, and if it's an honest one, then together the chair and the CEO will manage it.
And I think remembering ultimately that it is actually the board that is responsible, that the ultimate responsibility does sit with the board. So, yes. It's very important. Susan?
The only thing that I would add to that, certainly phone line between chair and chief executive is always open, and so as a chair you do expect to be rung if something goes wrong, but also from a chief executive point of view, once something has gone wrong, then it's a collective responsibility, and the board will be right in behind the chief executive trying to find the right outcome of how you fix the problem in the best interest of the company. So I think there shouldn't ever, or from my perspective, there's certainly no blame culture or anything like that when things go wrong in an organisation. I think we've all been around long enough to know that things do go wrong. What's really important is how well it's managed once it's gone wrong. And as I say, once you've shared that, with the chair and with the board, you're all in there 100%, just trying to get the best outcome for the organisation.
So have any of you got stories of things that have gone wrong, and perhaps to illustrate that point?
Well, I'm not going to be explicit about the thing that went wrong, but it probably made my relationship with Chris Kelly at Landcorp. There was something that was done that the board wasn't told about, and I picked it up accidentally and phoned as I went into a meeting to say, can you find the minute that approved this? And it hadn't gone past the board. And he was devastated, but he had no knowledge either. And I said to look, we're in this together. And he really appreciated that. I think our relationship improved immensely from that time onwards, that the pair of us had to deal with it. To be honest, in the end, the thing that was done without his or board approval was actually the right thing to do. It was just the process was wrong.
So basically you had his back.
Sorry?
Mean, you had his back. I mean, he was aware that
I always had his back.
Tony, have you got any story?
There was one where, in one of my companies, a employee was appointed to a board, and I read about it in the paper, and I was pretty disappointed that it hadn't been discussed both with me as chair and also with our REM committee. And it was one of those ones that wasn't clear in the delegations as to where it sat, but to me it was just blatantly obvious that it was a matter that should have been discussed prior with the board. So that was probably a good example of something that was a learning experience for the CEO.
Susan?
I guess some of the ones that probably come up from time to time, things involved either with fraud or with serious misconduct of individuals, which isn't aligned with the culture or the standards of behaviour that might be expected. And those are the types of things which actually need to be handled very carefully and very delicately, because again, both within the organisation but externally to the reputation of the organisation, things can fly out of hand very quickly. And so I think once you do have major incidents like that could impact the reputation, if they were to make the front page of the Dom, for example, it is very important at that stage to escalate it and involve, at least the chair, even not the whole board, in how we're going to manage a situation which could be very damaging reputationally for the organisation.
All right, so, I mean, obviously your CEO is pretty key to the organisation, well, is as you've suggested, Alison, the key person in the organisation. So let's talk succession planning and how do you undertake succession planning in an organisation? And I know Air New Zealand in particular has been quite well known for its succession planning. What does good succession planning look like? And once you're there, how do you go about getting a good CEO? How do you make sure that you don't make that disastrous decision that is the wrong CEO, which really I think is the most threatening thing you can do to your company?
I think the first point to make is succession and appointment of a CEO is something boards don't do very often. So, probably the average duration of a CEO is, 5-7 years? The average duration of a board member is 7 to 9 years, so you're likely to only do it once on that board, so it's not something you do get a lot of practice at. To me, the best successions are ones that are planned. So, if you take the Air New Zealand example, Rob Fyfe, the board knew several, periods of years in advance what his likely timing was. And what we wanted was basically to set up internal candidates that were credible successors. And we use this sort of concept of internal externals or external internals, so people who were fresh to the industry but had some relatively short experience within Air New Zealand, so we could determine whether their values and their culture set were appropriate for us. And I think that's the lowest risk. So take, for example, Christopher Luxon. He was brought in probably 12 months before we commenced the process for Rob's succession. He was brought in on the understanding that he could be a strong contender, but no promises, and that would be a full search. And he came in on that basis. But because we had 12 months of history with him, we knew, what his attributes, what his culture, what his values would be, and it really de-risks the appointment. So I think that's a good practice. But, you'll get some, for example, when I joined Foodstuffs back in many, many years ago, I spent 9 months sort of effectively understudying the previous CEO. Now that wouldn't work in most organisations, but it worked on that occasion, and I've seen it work. Christopher spent 6 months as CEO designate to Rob Fyfe at Air New Zealand, it worked. Whereas Mark Adamson, who took over from Jonathan Ling, they sort of shook hands in the corridor as one went out and one walked in. And I don't think there's any saying that one is particularly right or one is particularly wrong. I think it's very much environment and culture and everything plays into that.
And thank you. And what about the search process? Alison or Susan, have you got... what about the process of actually finding a new CEO? So if you...
I think it's a good question. I think things keep changing all the time. I've always been very much in favour of an appointment of someone who really understands the industry in their bones. Because if they do that, they know within parameters what's possible, and you don't have flights of fancy. I think it's great if you can breed your own replacements. You can't always do that, but at the very least, internal appointments should always get an interview. I think it's fundamentally important for the culture of the company that the internal people do have an opportunity. But then listening over the last few days at Global Woman on Saturday morning to discussion of artificial intelligence, this morning to discussion around disruptive technologies, etc. You can't envisage that the CEO role is as narrow as perhaps it once was. You do, maybe it's the type of person you have, a glass half full rather than a glass half empty one, or worse still, the person for whom the glass will break, cut them and they'll bleed themselves to death. You need the glass half full person, an open, inquiring mind, and someone who's ready to embrace change, someone who's interested to be aware of what change is coming.
Susan?
I guess I'm a great fan of actual leadership development within companies, and I think it's really important to be investing in leadership development. I think it came up this morning, the fact that, it's at that middle management, tier 3, tier 4, that if we haven't got good leaders at that stage, then where's the future of the company coming from, especially if you're in growth mode and you're going to have to keep backfilling people because you're growing. So I do really like to see leadership development within an organisation, and part of that we see very much as succession planning. And so going through certainly each tier 2 role and the chief executive as to who's ready now, who could be ready for that role in 2 years, who could be ready for that role in 5 years, and be picking out those people that you are developing through the organisation for the future. I do think when you come to having to make that appointment for a chief executive, it is important actually to have an external process as well, because I think even if an internal candidate is to get the role, it's very good that they've been through a process which has benchmarked them against the external environment, and when they do get selected, everybody knows they're absolutely the best person for that role, for the organisation, and that be it whether they've come from inside or outside. So I do like to go through a robust and rigorous appointment process, as opposed to just appoint, the next person to the role.
So this would really require a close relationship really between the board and the CEO to actually make sure that they've got, within the executive, they have that succession process going on, and that you do have capable people coming up through there, and that they do understand that obviously that will then be benchmarked against an external process. That's what I'm hearing from you all.
All my companies, there would be a regular discussion at the REM committee,
right,
around succession.
around succession,
and high potential people down 2 layers, as Susan says, ready now, ready in 5 years,
and
value professional, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah. And particular focus on continuing education opportunities. You've got
Yeah.
an organisation has a responsibility to grow their people. It starts with the CEO.
Which is really interesting, because often when companies get under pressure, it's the first thing that goes, and perhaps it's the last thing to go. It's actually the thing you need to focus on more. Yeah. Alison, you raised an interesting issue earlier, and that was the challenges, and we heard a lot about them this morning, that are coming through from this digital world out there, and the speed of change, and actually things we don't even know are coming over the horizon, that are coming at with such speed that if we don't actually, get some radar, we're going to get knocked over by them. How do we, keep up with that at the board table? Because there was a suggestion this morning that boards were very impoverished when it came to people with technical capabilities around the table to keep companies up. Doesn't matter which company, but to keep. And secondly, to make sure that you know that you have that at either chief executive or executive level where you can call on that skill. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. You were all here. Tony and Susan may not have been, but 10% only of non-executive directors. And if you are not a telco or a technology company, 5%. A bit frightening, really. I attended a session on Saturday talking about artificial intelligence, and the discussion was around, I think it was oleographs, and the capture of data analysis and action of the result of the analysis happens in nanoseconds and faster than the human intelligence can sort it out. And by the time the action's been implemented, far too late for humans to catch up, let alone regulators. So, this is all quite frightening stuff, and we're promised that the speed of change is increasing all the time. At board level, you need to be aware of the threats of disruption and how your business can be disrupted. You need to be sure that you've got competency within the organisation and at board level. And I haven't thought through fully just what that means at board level, because unless the board listens, then one person on a board isn't enough to achieve change or agreement to change. So the board needs to be aware of the risks as that affects their business, what's needed to mitigate, how to be informed. Someone mentioned mentoring. I don't know whether that's appropriate enough. I think this is all new, all a new challenge at governance level. I don't know what Tony and Susan think.
So that was an idea, just to pick up on that, I'll come back to the others, but of having advisors, advisors out. In other words, not all the competence has to be at the board table, which was, I think...
I struggle a bit with advisors to the board, because at the end of the day, the board's responsible. And I think all board directors are required to form their own view. So you can't really rely on advice. So Tony, Susan, how do you think about it?
I guess from my point of view, I think the chief executives have a really important role in this, and where I chair the board, I certainly make sure that our chief executives, either on a weekly or a monthly basis, are copying the board on key articles that they're reading across a number of magazines, etc., industry magazines, journals, whatever, but they're making sure they're copying the board on the articles that are important for the board to keep up to date with emerging trends in technology and in their industry. So I think that's a really important role, because the board members don't have time to read 5 journals in each industry, but it is important that they actually get sent on the articles which are important and which are setting the trends. The other thing that we always do is have 2 strategy sessions a year. And again, the chief executives get in the top people from around the world to give us a lecture on what's happening. So, for example, I chair Airways, which is air traffic control. So we had the head of strategy for Boeing on a video link spend an hour and a half with us as to where they see the future of air travel going, what's the growth, what kit they're going to have on the front of the aircrafts, how they see the whole industry emerging. So we had 2 or 3 people internationally speak to us by video conference to our strategy session to help open the eyes of the board as to where the industry might be going in the future.
Fascinating. Tony?
I think of the biggest challenges facing boards, I think this is the one. I mean, you could argue that this is our industrial revolution, and businesses are changing. You look at organisations like Airbnb and Uber, and they've changed industries almost, not quite overnight, but very close to it. And that's scary. I suppose the board's role is to ask questions and to read widely and to bring experience from other industries and other boards they're on and say, have we thought about this? And that's where I think diversity is really important, and diversity around a board table is critical, and it's diversity of thought. It's people asking questions that others hadn't thought of. One of the best people I know for doing that, and now Alison will know him very well, is Hugh Fletcher. Hugh had this amazing ability, or still does, to just ask a question that takes a debate in a completely different direction. And I think that's the role of the board, is to challenge, to ask the right questions, so that management think about the correct and try and arrive at the strategies that are appropriate.
So make sure you have the right conversations.
To make sure you have the right conversations.
Yeah. Alison, have you got some thoughts on that?
I agree with Tony. Advisors to two boards that I've been on have said of Hugh, could he be persuaded to ask the question at the beginning of the conversation instead of at the end? And that would mean we don't have to start all over again. So it's not only diversity, but it's also huge intelligence that matters.
Yeah, so diversity, let's just focus on that for a minute, because the interesting thing about diversity is that the work that's been done around the brain, I think, and I'm involved with the Centre for Brain Research, actually shows that by the time you reach your late 20s, the brain is actually physically grooved. In other words, your own environment has got so narrow that and your repeat activities have actually grooved your brain to think only in one way. And if you're sitting there surrounding yourself with other people who think in the same way, then imagine the thoughts that you're missing out on, and secondly, think with fear of actually what you're not seeing. So that's when diversity of thinking becomes really important. So can I just perhaps ask you, in terms of both diversity at your own board tables and in diversity in terms of your organisations, thoughts, how do you make sure that you have that sort of diversity of thinking and perspective?
Well, can I just make a point in respect of what you're saying, Jo, that one of the great things about directorships, and if you have a number of career streams through your working life, you do go from across a variety of boards, so that, and nothing's ever easy, so that you are continually stretched in different industries about different questions. And I think, Tony, in an interview with you that was published last week, you said that the transfer of learnings and information from board to board can be incredibly useful. But outside that, I agree with everything that's said in support of diversification, but don't let it be for diversification's sake, that you are aware of the attributes that you are seeking on a board, identify people who have them, and then balance for diversity within that qualification if you can.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, some of the appointments we've made at board level, I have said as chair to the search company, I expect that these are the skill sets we want, and I expect that the names that you'll provide me, I will know none of the people on that list. And that's actually quite an interesting way of looking at it, because then you get genuine diversity, because you get people who think differently to you. And Alison's right, it's all about diversity. It's not diversity of gender, it's diversity of thought.
Susan?
Yeah, no, look, I'd certainly support that. I mean, people absolutely, as a first cut, need to have the competence and the skill set that you're looking for on the board. So, I mean, there'll be a general director competence that's required, and that's baseline to even get the interview. But then it depends what skill set's required on the board at that time. And so you'll be looking for a very specific skill set, not just for a general director. Within that, then if you've got 2 or 3 people, again, you'll then take into account what's the diversity. You know, if somebody is exactly the same background as somebody else, you'll try and choose someone with a different background to get that variation of thought. But they've got to pass the tests on the skill set you're looking for and the general competence first.
All right. So I'm just going to go out there and see if I can pick up some questions, but I will just, I guess, leave you with one to follow up on what you've just said, and that is, if you're looking for certain competencies, is one of them to think differently? Would that be a...
I can tell you, at Air New Zealand, that was specifically the instruction to the search company.
Right.
But I suggest, Jo, it may relate to the type of person you are too.
Right, let me pick up a couple of questions out here.
Thank you. I'm James Fletcher, MD of OCS and on the steering group of the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum. If I could pick up on Dame Allison's potential glass holding fatality. Given we're talking in the context of rethinking the CEO and board relationship, what do you see as that relationship in respect of health and safety leadership and how boards can lead and support their CEOs in that health and safety context?
Thanks for that question. And I can actually give you an example. At Vector, where we have, bonus and STI systems, there are two hurdles to reach before there is a payment. The first is no fatalities, and no one in the organisation gets a bonus or an incentive if there is a fatality. I have to confess, I started off thinking, that's a bit tough. What opportunity does a telephonist or receptionist have to alter the behaviour of a 18-year-old linesman who thinks they're bulletproof? I've proven to be absolutely wrong in that, because it's all about the culture in the company. So that was a board dictum, but it's one that the CEO has bought into totally, and emphasis on health and safety in Vector is huge. In the back of my car, I have a bag with all my safety gear in it, and we are all very involved in the way the company is addressing the identification of risks, how they're managed and how they're monitored. And another example is Landcorp. I think that with forestry, farming is the most hazardous occupation in the country, and a particularly dangerous activity is quad bikes. Now, Landcorp, at least a decade ago, maybe longer, introduced farm safe policy, and requires that you have a hard hat on and your safety vest before you get onto a quad bike. There is no doubt that no one on any of the Landcorp farms would tolerate an employee who disregarded that rule. So that's the culture, that we have rules so that people can go home safe at night, and there is intolerance for any diversion from it. So I think that at Vector, probably Michael Stairsney led the drive there, but followed very closely by Simon McKenzie. At Landcorp, it was probably CEO and the farm executive team who did.
If I could just add to that, certainly all the boards I'm on, health and safety is the number one agenda item, and so that has helped focus on it by bringing it up the level to be, as I say, the top agenda item. At Housing New Zealand, one of the things we did as a board was introduced health and safety awards, and so we have those awards once a year for an initiative that comes through on health and safety, and those awards are made by the board, and the finalists and the winners have lunch with the board once a year. So again, that helps send the signal through the organisation that it's absolutely the board's expectation that everybody goes home safe at night.
I'll perhaps finish with a little anecdote. One of my companies uses the term world class a lot, and says we are a world class company. And one of our directors made the observation, you can't be a world class company if you've got a TRIFR of 15. And that one statement, the CEO is now incredibly focused on TRIFR, because it brought home to him that to be world class, you've got to be world class in everything, including health and safety.
Yeah, hi, I'm Shane DeForce of Dominion Salt, based in Tauranga. Actually, you said CEO is a very lonely place to be, and I think this table was just like that till Joe turned up. But anyway, Dame Allison, you picked up on the managed and government's divide. And perhaps I'm looking for a bit of advice on this. A lot of companies, particularly privately owned companies like my own, the board are there for governance, but it's often made up of executives from the shareholding companies. And there's often, I would say, issues with shareholding companies who are also suppliers and or customers of the company, and the governance management divide someone gets a little bit muddied from times, and that can strain the relationships at the board table. Can you give me your take on that? And I think, Dame Alison, you brought that up, and you've all had something to say.
I think you're absolutely right. I was director of a small, medium-sized company. I was appointed a director. I gave up on them in the end. I do think the failure to separate out governance and management results in failure for a lot of organisations. I think the first step is to make sure at a governance level that there are regular meetings, and the agenda must be managed so that the strategic and overview items are looked after at that meeting, that there is review of discussion of operational results, etc., but just a clear focus on the governance responsibility and making sure that the agenda is aligned with that. The separate or operational reviews should be a separate meeting. Now, Tony, as CEO of Foodstuffs, would have close experience with owners, shareholders, etc., getting involved in the I was going to say muddle.
Yeah.
Confusion.
Like herding cats. Yeah, I mean, I think it is a genuine problem. Because I also have been involved in boards like that where the directors are not truly directors. They're very much executives who don't understand the difference. I suppose the only advice I can do is get alongside the chairman and try and get him or her to understand the issues from your perspective and get him to give guidance to the rest of the board.
And you might be helped with someone independent who is experienced in governance to join the board. It is amazing how often, when that's done, someone who was there at the time this person comes on board says that the change in behaviour was noticeable and immediate. So that's another thought.
I guess just to add to that, where I went on to a very tightly held private board, unfortunately, due to a death, I ended up taking over as chair. The first thing that I did was got the constitution changed such that the majority of the board, or 50% or more of the board, had to be independent. And that, again, changed the whole landscape because it has to have an independent chair and 50% or more independent, so therefore you can set the agendas and turn it around away from operational into a governance board.
Hi, my name's Hilary Sumpter from the Auckland Communities Foundation. You've talked quite extensively about the succession plan for the CEO, but I'm also curious of your views from each or all of you about the succession planning for the new chair and the relationship of the CEO and what input a CEO may or may not have to that appointment and what consideration of the changing dynamics, the impact of that on the organisation could be.
That's an interesting question. I'm going to give it to Tony first and then I'll follow up.
There's probably two ways that I've seen it done. One is where the outgoing chair takes a leadership role and basically almost anoints his or her successor and then works with the board to support that. And the other way I've seen it done is where there is essentially a contest where directors throw their hats in the ring, say, I want to be chair, and it's a beauty parade. I certainly favour the former because I think then you can have a much better process around it. But that requires the leadership from the outgoing chair as to what he is looking for, and in that way you can have an involvement with the CEO as to who they think. The most recent one I've been involved with was more of the beauty parade, but the CEO was a director, and they were able to have input as to say, yes, I'm very comfortable working with so-and-so if he was appointed chair.
I don't want to give them before you, Susan, but just finish mine and then you can. I think that the relationship between chair and CEO is a very delicate one. Two of my past CEOs who were just top people are now amongst my closest friends, but we didn't have that relationship when I was chair and that person was CEO, because if you've got an issue, as chair, you have to be in a position where you can act firmly and decisively and not have a relationship get in the way. And Jo gave us a list of questions. She hasn't actually dealt with the tough ones yet, which I've spent a bit of time thinking about, but about constructive and disruptive tension on boards and how do you manage that. I simply say to you that a chair needs to know that they have board support. So too much CEO influence and chair selection might cut across that, and it might cut across independence. I think that the CEO has a very legitimate interest in who their chair will be, and the relationship has to be one of mutual respect and ability to work together. But I just make those points. Sorry, Susan.
No, that's right. The only point that I would make about it is I think it is important to consult the chief executive, simply because they are going to have to work with them and it's going to have to be a good working relationship. But secondly, I think the chair who's selected for that, it's essential at what stage the organisation is and what the risk appetite is. Because again, you have a mix on the board of some people are very visionary and growth oriented, and you have other people around the board who can always throw cold water on everything which comes forward. So you've got to be really careful in selecting the chair that you don't get the cold water person all the time, because otherwise that's going to be very demotivating for both the chief executive and their executive team if every time something comes up, cold water gets thrown on it.
All right, well, I'm sorry I'm going to throw cold water on the end of the discussion. It's been a fantastic discussion. Dame Alison, I'm really sorry I didn't get to those questions, and we'll have to do it again. Otherwise, they're going to throw me out for being a bad chair for not keeping to time.
Can I just add one thing? I attended a couple of the sessions this morning because it was a very good program, and I congratulate you on it. I think it was in Roger Sharp's that there were a couple of comments made which spoke rather negatively about CEO, senior leadership team and board sort of dynamics. I don't know, maybe I was feeling defensive, but I picked them up. I think that you all should expect to have a good working relationship with your chair and your board. You should expect them to leave you to run the operation and unhindered. But importantly, you know, the relationship should be a very positive one. And I hope that that's the way most of you feel about the relationship what you have with your chair and your board. It's just a good opportunity to make the point, Jo.
Thank you, and it's a great point to end on. So thank you very much. And can you just say thank you for 3 of our really best chairs in the country? Thank you.